If the item is ready, I'm ready. Oh. Okay, so I'd like to talk about some dinim in Maacholei Akkum, and I'm going to use a few examples of some common questions or certain foods, basically certain products that we're all familiar with, a little bit of the raid behind it. And to me, there seems to be a little bit of confusion, a little bit in these regards. And I'm going to try to make a little bit of at least according to my understanding, try to give over how it is. So the Chachamim instituted in the beginning of the second chelik of Yeridea. So you have a series of gzeiros that the Chachamim made, against foods that were cooked by a goy. And again, the concern there is not really that there's machalas asuris in the food. There were such a certain, for example, Maacholei Akkum was instituted out of concern that there might be some non-kosher, some chalav tamei mixed in. But before Maacholei Akkum, you have Pas Akkum, Bishul Akkum, and Shecher Akkum, which were gzeiros that were instituted at different times for the same reason, mishum chasnus, to prevent social interaction and ultimately lead to chasnus. So Chachamim figured that the way to stop that, the way to make the gather against it, is in the inyanim of food. That's where you have primarily the main idea of social interaction. You invite somebody over to the house, you have them over for dinner, and that's how it develops into a much more serious and meaningful type of relationship versus just a regular neighborly hello, how are you, have a good day, etc. So the gzeira was the nature of the gzeira was very similar to prevent chasnas. You can have certain foods that were prepared by a goy mishum chasnas, but there were specific. It was divided into different categories, separate gzeiras, because they were instituted at different times, and the prate halachas of each one is somewhat different. So you have, for example, so the Chacham first of all made Pas Akkum. So they said anything that's in the category of a bread of a goy, because if a goy cooks a food, so if it's in the category of a bread, then it has a certain set of rules. If it's not in the category of a bread, then it has a separate set of rules. So what are the rules? B'chlolos, obviously, which is on one foot. So by bread, we have a special rule called Pas Palta. That means the Chachamim realized that it was too difficult in certain situations for the Yidden to handle that gzeira of not having goyish bread. Means if it's a Yiddish neighborhood, it's fine. You go to a Yiddish bakery, you get the Yiddish bread. But if you're living in the Sadeh, if you're living outside the town and you don't have a Yiddish bakery, so either you're going to bake your own bread or you're not going to have bread. And bread, bread is considered a staple food. In the original diet, that was considered the most important basic food that a person needs to survive. So you had basically, the Gemara says a story of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He saw the people were starving. He says, well, what's going on over here? There's no bakery over here. You can't get bread. So they pulled back the gzeira. And they didn't pull it back entirely, where they said, okay, this was a massive mistake of instituting a gzeira against Pas Akkum, and therefore we're revoking it. They didn't do that, but they divided it into two categories: Pas Balabais and Pas Palter. Means they differentiated if a goy is baking bread for his own personal use for his family, and now he wants to share with you. A neighbor bakes cookies, and don't worry, all the ingredients are kosher, and the oven you don't have to worry about because tam kelim einim b'nei yoyman. You don't have to really technically worry about any kashrus concern. But he wants to share the cookies with you. He wants to be a nice neighbor. No, that's Pas Palavais. That's usher. Okay? Pas Palter, if it was baked, it's called like by a professional, but it doesn't have to be a professional. If the purpose that it was baked was for that the person was planning on selling it or giving it away, in other words, it wasn't for his own personal use, so then that's a lower level, doesn't lead to such kirva because it wasn't his own personal bread that he's sharing with you. So therefore, if he does share it with you, it's not going to lead to so much closeness. And the Chacham pulled back the Isser on Pas Palter. Now there's a Machlekes in the Paskim. What was the nature when they pulled it back? In other words, so there's one Mahalach is that they basically they revoked the Isser against Pas Palter pretty much. That's more or less, that's the Ramaz Mahalach, that's the Ashkenazi approach. And therefore, you're allowed, Pas Palter is mutter. Because even if you go to ShopRite and they have the OU bread, so what does OU bread mean if it doesn't say Pas Yisrael? That means that it's Pas Palter. That means all the ingredients are kosher, but there's no mashgiach there turning on the fire to make sure that it's Pas Yisrael. So technically, someone who follows Ashkenazi minhag, based on the Ramah, you're allowed to buy that bread in ShopRite. Even if there's a kosher bakery 2 blocks away, it's a little bit of a tircha, right? Or it tastes a little bit better, or it's a little bit cheaper, right? Maybe even a lot cheaper. Then you're not mechuyev to go get the Pas Yisrael, you could get the Pas Palter. The Pas Palter, this way of learning is that the Pas Palter is the same like Pas Yisrael. The Isser was taken away, okay? And other Rishonim learn not like that they only pulled back in those types of situations. Al derech, this case in the Gemara where people were taka starving, where they didn't have Pas Yisrael available. So that's in such a matzah, in such a situation, that's where they said, okay, you're allowed to have Pas Palter. But if Pas Yisrael is readily available, so this is what Sfardim, this is the minute what Sfardim follow. The Mechaber is this, and then there's whole the prate halachis of what's considered readily available, how much you have to travel, 1 mil, 4 mil. If there's a quality, a type of bread, let's say you have lamashal rye bread, you only have in Pas Palter, you can't get it in Pas Yisrael, but you can get other kind of bread. So then you're allowed to also have, because the kind of bread that you want is not available. If the quality tastes a lot better, that you're going to eat more of it, it's also considered that the Pas Palter, that the Pas Yisrael is not available. But these are all pratim in for Sfardim. They have to know. For them, it's only mutter to get Pas Palter in a situation when Pas Yisrael is not available. So there's prate halachas of what does it mean that Pas Yisrael is not available. What do we follow Lamaisa, Lubavitch, and I think it's called Adas Chassidim, basically follow is the Arizal, which is brought in the Poskim. The Arizal writes, there's one who wants to be a chassid should refrain, even though it says al pi halach and Shulchan Aruch is that Pas Palter is mutar al pi din. Okay, at least in certain situations. But if one wants to be a chassid, then he should refrain from Pas Palter, even in those situations which, according to the Sfardim, which according to the Mechaber, you're allowed to have Pas Palter. Even in those situations, you should either bake your own bread or don't have bread, eat something else. Unless, of course, you're starving. We're not talking about that. But even in a place where you can't get Pas Yisrael, it's like what shluchim do. And in a place where you can't get Pas Yisrael, is they bake their own bread or they don't eat bread. Right? This is following the Arizal. It's not a din. In other words, all the paskim agree in such a situation where Pas Yisrael is not available, you'll zikr, according to all the paskim, be allowed to eat the Pas Palter. However, the chumrah is based on, it's a chumrah and it's from the Arizal. Okay, that is the din of Pas Palter. Now, if something is not a bread, doesn't fit the criteria halachically of a bread, then it doesn't have this rule. Pas Palter, it doesn't make a difference what the food, let's say you have a potato, it's cooked. Right? Or it could even be something mezainis, like lakshin, but it was cooked, so therefore it's not a bread. What does it mean a bread for these purposes, by the way? What it means a bread is hilchos berachas hanenin. That's what comes out from most of the poskim. It means if you're able to wash and bench on this food, even though the regular bracha is mezainis, what it means is like this, that you have, by bread, it's called lechem gomer and lechem she'eina gomer. Lechem gomer is flour and water, right? Made into a dough and baked. That is lechem gomer. So then you always have to make hamoitzi, and you have to make a berachas hamazon. Even if you only eat a kazayis, you have to make a berachas hamazon. Lechem she'eina gomer is something which is what we call mezainis, right? It's more of something which is generally eaten as a snack, because it's made lamashal with fruit juice or something like that of that nature, or it has a lot of filling, like chocolate, like kokosh cake or something. It has a filling that's very sweet, right? So that's mezainis. And but that's called lechem she'eina gomer. It's really a bread. Just the Chachamim said that if you didn't eat a shir kviyas suda, so your chiyuv of benching is only midirabanan. So then in such a case, you don't do berachas hamazon, you just do ala michya. So you do mezainis and ala michya. But if you're going to eat a full shir kviyas suda, which is a question exactly what that means, but let's like the lowest shir would be, let's say, dalad beitzim, like 8 ounces of it. So then you would have to make moitzi and berachas hamazon min hatayr. In other words, if I eat a kazayis of lechem gomer and you eat a whole kakash cake, your chiyuv berachas hamazon is min hatayr. I'm just to illustrate, your chiyuv of berachas hamazon is min hatayr, and my chiyuv berachas hamazon is midirabanan. In other words, it's real bread. The kakesh cake is bread. It's just lechem she'ein gomer. So if you eat less than a kriya soda, then you make a mezainis and ala michya. So that's bread. That follows the rules of pas akum. And if it's made for sale, then it's pas palter, which minadin is mutter. And the reason we don't eat it is a chumrah from the Arizal. But if it doesn't fit this criteria, let's say it's not made out of one of the chameshus minei dagan, or even if it is made out of the chameshus minei dagan, well, let's say it's cooked, it's not baked. So then it's lo'olim going to be mezainis and ala michya. It's not considered a bread b'chlal because it wasn't baked. So then it has the rules of Bishul Akkum, which was instituted a little later, and it has a little bit different rules. So on the one hand, it doesn't have the rule of palter. It makes no difference. This is the halacha. In the Rishonim, there's a shita, but the halacha doesn't make a difference if the food was cooked, let's say by the guy for his own family or for himself. And now let's say the cleaning lady cooks food for herself and she says, oh, you want to have some of this noodles? Or if she cooked it lechatchila for let's say like in the case like in a restaurant where the guy cooks for sale, like, that he's cooking for a sale, makes no difference. It's all Bishul Akkum. However, Bishul has other rules. It says in the Gemara that Bishul only applies. There's two shittas in the Gemara, but lahalacha we accept the kula of both of them. So it comes out lahalacha that Bishul Akkum would only be aser if it has two conditions. Number one, that the food is ein nechel chai, means that it wasn't edible before it was cooked. So if a guy cooks water, so it's not going to be Bishul Akkum because you could drink the water before it was cooked. Only if, let's say, cook the potatoes, so that's something which is not edible before it was cooked, so then it's subject to Bishul Akkum. That's condition number one. Condition number two is that it has to be oila shulchan malach. It has to be a chashiv of food. Because if it's not chashiv, so then, again, it's not so significant. Chachamim didn't aser it in that case. So what does it mean, oila shulchan malach? So here's where a lot of the discussion, what we want to talk about, has to do. So the discussion of oila shulchan malach and what it means. So first, let me tell you the conclusion halacha, which is what's accepted by all the kashrus in organizations. Let's say the OU, the OK, the Chavk, all the reputable national kashrus organizations, and in the Svarim, in other words, and it appears that this is ongoing. This is the accepted halacha. So I'm going to tell you the conclusion first, and then we're going to go through a little bit of a discussion. And that is that what oila shulchan malacha means is that what's fit for a king's table doesn't have to be dafke a king. That's actually brought from the Arizal also. It doesn't have to be a king dafke. It could be sari. In other words, any mechubedik person. But what it means is that it has to be what's suitable for a formal table. Shulchan malachim. It gives in other words, you kind of think of a formal dinner. Like when it would be not what the president eats when he's watching football or something. He could also maybe eat popcorn or candy or whatever it is, right? We know of, but what it means is what's let's say they're going to invite the prime minister of Japan for a state dinner. So what's going to be served at a formal meal, which if you want to like kind of apply it b'chlalis, that would be like what's suitable to go at a chasana or something. In other words, something a formal food, not a now. And so that's what's ongenommen by all the kashrus organizations. So any food that doesn't fit like so. Basically, what this means is that any snack food, any snack food, potato chips and popcorn and all these things are going to be, even if as long as there's a hechsher, which means as long as the kashrus organization ascertains that the ingredients are kosher and that the machine was kosher before it was processed, whatever it is. So then the item is kosher, even though they don't have a mashgiach coming every single day and turning on the fire. Okay, it's much more expensive that. In other words, to give a hechsher, so in certain types of products is very, very simple. In other words, if lamashal, there's no reason to be concerned that the guy is going to use the non-kosher ingredient, because let's say the kosher ingredient is just as available and it's cheaper and it's a factory setting. There's no concern. That's like a restaurant where the guys going in and out and they run out of food. That's much stricter situation, and most kashrus organizations would require, most achshim would require mashgiach there, and at least a frum yid there the whole entire time. right? Because it's very hard to, well, let's say if it's a factory thing and they know their ingredients and they're not substituting anything. So as long as you ascertain that all the ingredients are kosher and you make a spot check, whatever it is, depending on the type of place, once a year, twice a year, whatever they deem is necessary, so then it's very easy, it's very cheap to give a hechsher. And their goal is to give a hechsher on as many products as possible. Meaning as long as there's a reliable heter, what to rely on, they're not looking to be machmir for it should be the high. They don't claim, right? If you call up the OU or the OK or the Chafk, they don't claim that it's the higher standard that keeps every chum in the book. That's not what they're geared for. That they're a national hechsher. They're trying, as long as the product is kosher, they're going to give a hechsher. You might want to keep a certain chumrah. So, for example, they're not going to give a hechsher on pas palper. No, it's kosher. You want to keep the chumrah of darizal, so keep the chumrah of darizal. But not because of that, we're not going to give a hechsher on this product. You understand? So, Mela, all these kind of products that we're going to, in other words, that to the judgment of the hechsher is not oila shulchan malachim. In that type of definition that we gave before, the very formal kind of setting, then they're able to give a hechsher and that they feel that that's 100% kosher, and they're right. They're right. The strict reading of the Shulchan Aruch and the Paskim, they're 100% right. Now, in all honesty, I'm going to say over some of the other shittas that are out there. I'm calling them out there because there's no grounded actual source that you could point to in Sfarim that actually hold this way, all right? But I'm saying it's out there because anecdotally or whatever it is, there's the word that this one may have held that way or that one may have held that way. So I'm going to say it over. So it's a possibility that some learn, some are it's attributed to certain rabbanim or paskim that the pshat in oil shulchan malachim means that a food which a chash of a person, a melech or a sar would eat, not the pshat that's suitable to go on a formal table, but he would eat. In other words, in the olden days, like you see it in this farm, like a rich people would never touch bread with bran in it, right? It would make them nauseous. They wouldn't be able to go near it, right? There were standards of foods. There was the rich man's food and there was the poor man's food. That doesn't exist today. So someone will learn again, I can't even point to any sefer that holds this way. I'm just saying, but it's out there. There's such a concept that maybe what it means is that what's suitable, that what a rich man would eat. So now this goes according to time and place. So it means if you hold like that shita, that means that nowadays every food that's at least not edible raw, any food that's not edible raw that was cooked by a guy is automatically Bishul Akkum. In other words, the heter of not oil shulchan malachim doesn't apply anymore nowadays. Why? Because nowadays, rich people and important people, they eat all these kind of nash, right? We had presidents that like jelly beans, and I read once that Warren Buffett is one of the richest people in the world. So he eats his diet every single day is potato chips and Coke. He even jokes about it that he saw that 6-year-olds, they're the healthiest. They have the healthiest blood and everything. So he figured he'll copy a 6-year-old diet. And he's well into his 80s, I think. Not 90, I don't know. And this is his diet for the last who knows how long. So they eat nash. In other words, there's no such thing. So if you hold like this, that taka means that al pi din, any food that's not edible raw would automatically be awesome mishlam b'shul akkum, because today's day and age, any food is really suitable for a wealthy chash of a person. But like I said, this shita, you can't even, I haven't at least found anywhere where it's even brought down. I heard this one may have held like that, or Moshe may have held that way because he's masupik about French fries, and it's not, there's nothing that you could point to and be done on and discuss it and rayas, etc., etc. Now, also, by the way, this goes against the simple reading of what it means, shulchan malachim, the simple words, the simple tai. Shulchan malachim implies that it's more of a formal table, not that what he eats when he's just mashing, not sitting at a table. That's first of all. And second of all, it also goes against the whole concept of why they had this condition. Because why do they have this condition? That it should only be a chash of a food. It shouldn't be anything a guy cooks. Chash of a food, because you only invite someone for a chash of a food. Right? You're not going to invite your neighbor, You're not going to invite a friend and say, come over and serve them popcorn, right? You're going to invite them over for a meal, something a chashuv thing. So it goes against the whole. That was a reason why they didn't say it's any food. It was specifically such a chashuv type of a food. So that's the whole concept of this condition. The whole seichel behind it lends itself to say that that's not the way to learn. What the pshat is at a formal meal, and therefore, al pi din, any kind of snack food is mutter. Potato chips and all these kind of things is mutter al pi din, mishum bishul akkum, because it's not oila shulchan malachim. Now, there was supposedly also another, I would call it a misconception, really, because it's also, there's no such a shita in the poskim. There is maybe such a shita in the Rishonim, but not such a shita in the Paskim. That when we say what a food is oila shulchan malachim, so what it means is that type of food could be made into something which is oila shulchan malachim. So let's take potatoes, for example. Everyone would agree over here that mashed potatoes is served at a chasana, right? Or roasted potatoes is served at a chasana. You're not going to find potato chips, right? But what it means, oila shulchan malachim, is that since this kind of food, the min oichel, it goes by the type of food, right? Since this food could be made into something which is fit for a king's table, so mamela loy plug anything made out of potatoes, even if in this type of tafshil, the way it's prepared is clearly not oila shulchan malachim because potato chips is just a snack food, but that would also be also because it goes by the type of food. So I'm not saying there's not such a notion in the Rishonim. I believe there is from the Yisr V'Heter. I didn't have a chance to double check, but I believe it's from the Yisr V'Heter. There's such a notion in the Rishonim, but in the Paskim, it's clearly not. In other words, it's not even brought down. In other words, the halacha, it's clearly the opposite. That we find clear rayas, numerous places that we clearly don't go according to the type of food. We go according to the type of tafshil, the type of dish. For example, let's go right in the beginning of these halachas. So it speaks about rice bread. So it says that rice bread is not as misum pas akum, or in other words, it doesn't have the rule of pas palter or whatever it is. Nothing to do with that. Why? Because it's not a bread. It's not made out of one of the 5 grains. It's not made out of the chameshus minei dagan. So it doesn't have the rule of pas. So it goes with the rules of bishul. So is it as misum bishul akum? So it depends if it's oila shulchan malachim or not. So over there it says that generally speaking, rice bread is not oila shulchan malachim, because on shulchan malachim you'd have regular bread, not rice bread. So therefore, rice bread is not oila shulchan malachim. So therefore, it's mutter sai mitzad pas because it's not a pas, and sai mitzad bishul because it's not oila shulchan malachim. But the same poskim who bring this lahalacha that say that it's mutter because it's not oila shulchan malachim clearly bring down that a regular bowl of cooked rice is also misum bishul akkum because it is oila shulchan malachim. So you see clearly that it depends on what format it's made. One type of tafshil, if that is oila shulchan malachim, then it would be asr. The other type of tafshil, if it's not, there would be mutter. Even though from the same food you could make something else which is oila shulchan malachim. And we find like that many examples. Speaks about kind of bean. I'm not sure if they're a nut or a bean. That if it's roasted, it's one thing, and if it's cooked, I don't remember which one's which now. I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to see it inside recently, right? So if it's roasted, it's let's say not oila shulchan malachim, and if it's cooked, it is, or vice versa. I don't remember, right? So you see clearly that it goes according to the way that the tafshil is prepared. In other words, not necessarily. Don't say that since in the other form it is oila, so therefore this type of food, no matter what way it's prepared, it's going to be awesome. So Mela, that's debunked. Again, if someone were to claim that that's a shita in the paskim, then the person would be wrong. It's not a mishigas. There is such a shita in the Rishonim, but it's not the halacha. Ramah brings down the Prichadash and all the paskim that discuss this issue. It's clear they all quote all these halachas that we just mentioned. So therefore, will come out lefizah that the fact that you can make roasted potatoes out of potatoes won't mean, and that is oila shulchan malachim, or mashed potatoes. That's not going to make potato chips, aser. So it would appear to me that what I'm saying, so what comes out, at least Lania's daiti, is that al pi din, what the hechsherim companies, the national brand hechsherim companies, what they follow, the shita that they follow, that means oila shulchan malachim, that means what's served, the type of dish that's served at a formal meal, and anything not like that is mutter al pidin, even if you don't need to have the mashkiach turn on the fire. That seems to be a legitimate heter. That's the pashut pshat in the paskim, in the Shulchan Aruch, and in the paskim. Now, is there any reason to prefer the Yiddish brand companies that they do have a mashkiach, in other words, that they do make it Bishul Yisrael? So in my opinion, at least, that the only real reason to prefer it, again, unless you're going to be choishish for that first shita that I said, that it's attributed officially, saying it's hard to pin it down, but that notion that it goes by according to the person, do nowadays, chashav people do eat everything. So then again, then al pi din, there's a reason to hold that it should be done by a yid, that the yid should turn on the fire. But otherwise, the pashat pshat in the paskim, so there isn't really in other words, it's a full-fledged heter. In other words, it's totally kosher. And so what the Indian would be, according to my understanding, would be also based on the Arizal. So if you look up the Arizal, it happens to be the same Arizal that speaks about the pas palter chumrah. So over there, he also mentions in the same area, the same paragraph or the paragraph earlier, that one who wants to be a chassid should be machmer, that even though it says al pi din, that if something's not oila shulchan malachim, it's mutter mishum bishul akkum, but if somebody wants to be a chassid, he should be machmer and insist that, and shouldn't basically eat anything that was cooked by a guy, even if it's nechal chai, and even if it's oila shulchan malachim. And the Maacholei brings us from a Gemara that there was a person that Eliyahu Hanavi used to come, and he got Gili Eliyahu basically, and Eliyahu stopped coming, and he tried finding out what was the reason Eliyahu stopped coming, and it turned out that because that he drank water that was cooked by a guy. So the Gemara says, oh, he drank water cooked by a guy. Maybe this proves the shita that if it's nechal chai, it's mutter. Maybe this proves that even though it's nechal chai, you're still not allowed to have it. Eliyahu stopped coming. So the Gemara says, no, it was mutter al pi din. Eliyahu stopped coming. He was an adam chashav. He had Gili Eliyahu. He should have had a higher standard, right? So Eliyahu stopped coming because he had water that was cooked by a guy. Doesn't mean that al pi din, it's usher to drink water that was cooked by a guy. So you see here from the Gemara that even though something is nechal chai, an adam chashuv al kol panim, an adam chashuv should hold himself to a higher standard, and it's explained in the paskim because adam chashuv, people look at them, people learn from them, so therefore they should hold a higher standard. So there happens to be a machlokes in the paskim between the shach and the Noida B'Yehuda. What is this for us, right? In other words, you have a Gemara that says that on the one hand, it's mutter al pi din. That was the maskanas Gemara, even though Eliyahu stopped coming. And the Gemara says, Adam chashav shani. So therefore what? So therefore it means that for us, it's not negeya because we're not an Adam chashav. Or does it mean that we're supposed to strive for this and we're supposed to behave like an Adam chashav? So it's at a machlokes in the paskim what we're so. So the shach tain is that it goes without saying. The paskim don't even have to mention this. It's obvious that Adam chashav has to hold himself to a higher standard. It's actually not a shach alasar. It's a shach much further. So not everybody realizes the shach. But that's what the shach shita is. And he says it's such a davar pashat, the pasuk don't even have to mention it, because it goes without saying that Adam chashav has to hold himself to a higher standard, and therefore, of course, you have to. And the dogma of Lovatain is no, Adam chashav yad Gili Eliyahu. And it means for us is, of course, we don't have to worry about it. That's what the Gemara says. Adam chashav shani. For us, we don't have to worry about this chumrah. So the Arizal learns like the shach. I mean, the Yisrael was before the shach. But I'm just saying in the paskim you have already such a machlokes. But the Arizal writes over there that we learn from the Gemara that's something we should strive for. That one who wants to be a chassid should be machmir. Not only so, if the Gemara says that it applies to something which is not edible raw, like water, so kol shkem v'kal v'chomer, it applies to something which is edible raw. Sorry, so kol shkem v'kal v'chomer, it applies to something which is not edible raw, and the heter is that it's not oila shulchan malachim, like potato chips or whatever it is. So Mela clearly there's mokem lahachmir, all right, based on the Arizal. And it's straight that it's clearly in the Arizal that right to Eliyahu's chassid should be machmer anything cooked by a guy. And by the way, that applies even if it's nechal chai. So it means that would mean tomato sauce, right? Even though it's Nechel Chai, that would mean potato chips, even though it's not Eilah Shulchan Malachim. Anything cooked by a goy, somebody wants to be machmir, somebody wants to be a chasser, should be machmir. Now, you'll ask yourself, and just something which bothered me a little bit, is no one ever heard of this Arizal. Everybody over here heard of the Arizal Pas Palter, right? So what's the pshat? So the pshat is that there's a lot of Arizals, right? That some Arizals are brought in the Paskim and some are not. Why? Which ones are? That I'm not going to claim to try to explain to you. I have no idea. But that's known. In other words, there's some Arizals that are brought in the Magen Avraham that are brought. There's some Arizals are brought lahalacha, and some Arizals are for I don't know, for those that follow the Shulchan Aruch Arizal. In other words, those that follow is different. So it happens to be that the pas is brought down in the Paskim, the Darkei Tshuva, whatever it is, it's brought down, and we know in the Chassidish Kreisen we're very, very makbid on it, for whatever reason. But this one, it's not really brought down. Is it because it's too hard? Is it because it's not for everyone? I don't know. I'm not going to suggest. But the point is, the Metzias Advarim is that one everybody keeps, the Pas Palter one everybody keeps, all Chassidim keep. And this one almost no one ever heard of. But to me, that's really the only reason, only strong reason at least, to insist on the Yiddish company products that actually have a mashgiach turning on the fire that will make a Bishul Yisrael.
Good question. What about stuff like punts or these potatoes?
So again, so it's obviously mutter that l'chol hadeis, because it doesn't even go into the question of what's considered Eilah Shulchan Malachim, because that's made out of tomatoes, and tomatoes are edible raw. So that's al pi din. You don't even have a question that does not have to be Bishul Yisrael. In the potato chips, there was that notion that maybe it goes according to the person, the chashav that people eat it nowadays, or that other shita in the Rishonim, which is not accepted lahalacha, that maybe it goes according to the type of food. So, but in this issue with the Hans Lamashal, so that's in al pi din, it's for sure. It doesn't even get involved in those issues. But according to the Arizal, that would be the same chumrah.
The potato chips, you have so many good from companies. Why bother?
I can't answer for that. I'm telling you what's coming out according to my understanding, and I'm being honest, and I'm sharing with you, to the best of my abilities of being able to explain it, the other views as well. Which one is it? It's bothering. Al pi din, it's 100% mutter. According to my opinion, if you're asking my opinion as someone who, I don't want to call myself a rav, but someone who learned the sugya, who teaches the sugya, who learned the paskim on this topic, was kumtais by mir, for the reasons that I outlined to you tonight. Kumtais by mir, that which is actually the same conclusion as all the hechsher companies that give the hechsher on that. Okay, that it's 100% acceptable. L'mashal, there's hechsher companies that give a hechsher like an OUD, and they rely on, let's say, Moshe's heter, and we know that we don't rely on that heter. It's based on something else, and we don't rely on that. I'm telling you, according to my understanding, on this one, Sal Pi Din, it's 100% acceptable. And is there any reason to be machler? Yeah, absolutely. But if you're going with that, if you're going down that road, then that road takes you to Yiddish companies across the board. And by the way, and it's not a stira. In other words, because it's only a chumrah, you could do whatever you could do, which means a product that's available in the Yiddish company you'll get, or when it's available you'll get it, and when it's not, you won't. But it's not. We're not claiming that it's asra al pidin. We're claiming it's a chumrah. So a chumrah, it's perfectly acceptable that you do it as best as you could when you could, and when you can't, you don't. I want to move on to a few other types of products that just to give a little, certain other issues. I want to explain something about Pringles. Very interesting. Issue with Pringles is in the end of the day, it's the same heter as potato chips. And the reason why it's mutter because not Eilah Shulchan Malachim, going with that definition that we gave. But it has one layer of complication. It has an additional layer of complication. What's that? Why are the Pringles, each one is exactly the same shape, and the potato chips are? So potato chips are just little peels of potatoes, right? So each one is a different shape. But the Pringles are basically they're made out of potato flakes or potato powder. So it means that they first cook the potato, then they dehydrate it, make it into the flakes or the powder. And then they reconstitute it and make it into like a flat dough. And they have like a machine that cuts out perfect ovals, exactly like that. And those ovals are then put into the deep fryer. And while it's in the deep fryer, it has another machine that presses it, and gives it that nice concave shape. Then it comes out and it's ready to go, right? So why is this more complicated? Because before it's turned into a potato chip, it's essentially a cooked potato. Now, if a guy cooks a potato, is that Bishul Akkum? Everybody's going to agree, right? That's Bishul Akkum. So once it's Bishul Akkum, it doesn't matter that you change the form, right? If it's Bishul Akkum, then it remains aser. In other words, once the potato is cooked and therefore could be made into something which is Eila Shulchan Malachim, so then it's aser, and then it doesn't matter that later you turned it into a snack food. Once it's aser, it remains aser. So what's the heter? So the heter is based on tshuva from the Mechaber, in the Sefer Avakas Ruchel. So over there, he's discussing a little bit of a different thing. I don't want to go into it because we're short on time. It's not exactly the same context. The context over there is a food which was cooked by a goy halfway, which for us Ashkenazim is perfectly fine that a yid gets involved in the cooking at this point after it's Maacholei ben Drusai. It's perfectly acceptable. But for Sfardim, this is not perfectly acceptable. For Sfardim, under normal circumstances, if it's not Hefseh Meruba, it's not Erev Shabbos, once the food was cooked already halfway by the goy, it's too late for a yid to get involved. So he's discussing a case that a goy cooked something halfway, then the food was dehydrated, made inedible, and a yid comes and rehydrates it and cooks it the rest of the way. So the Mechaber paskind that it's mutter. And the heter was that since the dehydrating basically negated the original cooking, so it took away the isser of the Bishul Akkum. So that's the heter over here as well. But again, over here is not the same issue that a goy cooked it halfway and a yid cooked it the other halfway. Over here is that first it's cooked into something which is Oila Shulchan Malachim, and later it's cooked into something which is not Oila Shulchan Malachim. But we take that yisoid from the Avakas Ruchel, that once it got dehydrated, the original cooking was canceled out, and the fact that it was already Bishul Akkum is taken away, that isser is taken away. Now we have a brand new process, which is, in the case of the Avakas Ruchel, was being done by the Yid, and in our case of the Pringles, made into something which is not Eila Shulchan Malachim. Okay? So which actually we find also in a different halacha, this concept that it doesn't only apply to, let's say, the case of the Avakas Ruchel, that it was first cooked partially by the goy and then later finished off by the yid after it was dehydrated. But when it's two different processes, the Gemara speaks about a case of a fish that was first salted. So it says that only cooking, frying, baking, these kind of things that use heat make something Bishul Akkum. But salting and smoking do not make something Bishul Akkum. If the goy does it, it's still mutter. So that's why, let's say, lax, it could be made, the goy could turn on the smoker. A yid doesn't have to turn on the smoker. Or a herring, if they make it salted, salting and smoking, those two processes do not have to be done by a yid. They're allowed to be done by a goy. It's not us mission Bishul Akkum. So the case was that a fish was salted, it was made edible, but they didn't aser it. Why? Because salting doesn't aser. And now it was cooked. So when it was salted, that particular fish was not Oila Shulchan Malachim. Or was it? It's irrelevant because the goy salting it would not make it aser, because salting doesn't make it aser. Now, after it was cooked, it is Oila Shulchan Malachim. Okay, but the reason why it's mutter is because since before it was cooked, which is the process which could aser it, because again, the salting process cannot aser it by the goy, but the cooking process, which could potentially aser it, since when that process was being done, it was already nechal, it was already edible, so therefore the cooking didn't aser it. So neither process asered it. The salting didn't aser it because salting doesn't aser it, and the cooking afterwards didn't aser it because before the cooking was already edible. So you see that as long as it's two different processes, one process and then the other process are each judged separately. So if the first, in our example, let's say the Pringles, if it's negated through the dehydrating, so then the second process, which is turning it into potato chips, if it's not Oila Shulchan Malachim, so then it's going to be mutter. So it has that extra layer of complication. Now, if you go with the mahalach of, which we said again is there's some sort of, there is a notion like this in the Rishonim, but it's not acceptable halacha, that it goes according to the min oichel, that potato chips, there's reason to be machmir because you could make roasted potatoes out of it. So if you go with that reason to be machmir with potato chips, so then perhaps Pringles is even more makel than regular potato chips. Why? Because what bracha do we make on Pringles? Pringles sha'akol. So one can argue that it doesn't have, that if you're concerned because it's the same min, so one can argue that perhaps it's not the same min. But that's all if you go with that mahalach, which to my understanding is not actually what's acceptable halacha. I do want to mention something I failed to explain before. I'll mention first briefly, because I wrote it down, the tuna fish, because we already mentioned about the salting and the smoking does not make. So lax is smoking, so that's not Bishul Akkum. Tuna fish is steaming. Okay, so what is it? Most canned foods, but a lot of canned foods are nechol chai. So really, it's not really a shaila if it's usher or not, because anyway, the vegetable that's in the can is already edible. So it's anyway not going to be. But something like tuna fish, which is not nechol chai, it's not edible before it's cooked. So the question is, does the steaming need to be Bishul Yisrael or not? So there are some places, this is already a Maacholei Akkum that's brought down already in the Darkei Tshuva, some of the earlier poskim, but there are some that want to learn that steaming is the same as smoking, right? It's removed. In other words, you're not putting it mamish in the pot, it's outside. So the same thing, smoking, steaming. And others want to learn, no, it's a different vart, that the smoking, it's not the heat that cooks it. It's the charifus of the smoke that cooks it. Mashenkin steaming, it's the hot water. So Mali, if it's actual pot of boiling water, or if it's turned into a steam, it's irrelevant. So the heter that these companies rely on is that it's mainly they're relying on that heter, that shita, that the steaming is the same as smoking, which again, strictly speaking, it's a nissa d'Rabbanan, and they should have a right to follow the more lenient opinion. But clearly being machmir, you're following a different shita. That's chaylik. That's point number one. But point number two, there's a separate concern with the tuna fish that has to do with a totally different isser, and that is a concern of there being a mixture. The Gemara speaks about this called tris trufa. The Chum made gzeira on crushed up fish, that you're not allowed to buy crushed up fish from a guy unless you saw that each fish that went into the grinder, you saw that it had the scales on it. You recognize Rosh Rubai of the fish, you're able to recognize what kind of fish it was. But the Vaistam say crushed up fish is a shaila, because you don't know if mixed in there could be pieces of a not kosher fish. So seemingly that concern is a problem. How they get around it, I believe they're following some poskim that learn that there's a mirtzas kind of a concern, that there's like this concept of uman lemeiro nasi that we find in many areas of halacha, that somebody who has a profession is not willing to ruin his profession, so they're scared to add in fish from a different kind. But there are many poskim that are machmir. Interestingly, Rabbi Moshe is very machmir about the tuna fish, even though he uses a similar svara, but maybe we'll have to talk about that in a different share. Regarding chalav, he uses this concept of mirsas, of them being afraid, as knowledge for us that it's considered chalav Yisrael. So that's an additional issue. There's nothing to do with Bishul Akkum. That's a very, very good reason to insist on the Yiddish company that pays more for the mashgiach to be there the whole time, not just to turn on the machine in the morning, but also to see every fish that goes in, that, to see that the scales. But one last point I want to finish off here. It'll take me not more than 2 minutes. I just want to be mashed in the sugya if I can. I think part of the mistake, going back to the potato chips and going back to the issue of the min, if you go according to the min oichel or the min tafshil, the type of a food, you can make mashed potatoes out of it, so therefore potato chips are also aser, or do you go according to the type of a tafshil? So I think part of the mistake comes from a pri chadash. With the pri chadash, I don't have time to mention the context of the pri chadash, but I'll just mention what the pri chadash says. The pri chadash says something along these lines. He says something to the effect that he's talking about meat. He's talking about the kurkavan, the stomach of the animal. That even though most probably that's not really oila shulchan malachim, but hayos, other types of meat are oila shulchan malachim. So therefore, we say all meat, if it's cooked by a guy, it shouldn't be eaten. It's an asmis and Bishul Akkum. So that sounds like Bashkafa Rishayna, what we're saying, right? Sounds like That's, all types of meat, all types of potatoes, as long as you can make something out of it. That's not the correct shot. The correct shot is in that Pri Chadash, is what he means is as follows. Everyone would agree that, let's say, the mashed potatoes that you get from yeshiva is not oila shulchan malachim, or the chicken that you get from yeshiva is not oila shulchan malachim, right? It's not going to be. They don't use that quality. They don't use that quality meat. It's not spiced well. It's not, everyone understands it. But does that mean that that's not, because it wasn't prepared nicely, so therefore it's not oila shulchan malachim, therefore it's mutter? So that if the guy turned on the fire, the guy cooked it legambi, so it's going to be mutter because he didn't do a good job when he cooked it, he burnt it. Everyone understands yourself that just because he burnt it, or just because he didn't spice it well, or just because he didn't, so that's what it means. We don't want to be machalik. There's a loy plug. We don't want to have to start judging the meat that I have in my house. They're never going to serve in the White House. They have basar that shechted that day in the first cut and this. I can't afford that. So it means that a goy cooks in my house, so it's not Bishul Akkum? No, of course not. That's the loy plug that the Pri Chadash was referring to. That we don't want to have to start judging every cut of meat. Is this a good meat? Is this a bad meat? So therefore we say, okay, if a goy cooks meat, it's going to be awesome with some Bishul Akkum. But it's not coming to say that if you clearly have two distinct types of tafshilim, one type of tafshil which is served at a formal meal and one which isn't, so therefore they're both going to be aser. How do I know that this is not the correct shot? Because the Pri Chadash himself is amongst the poskim who quote all those halachas that I mentioned before about the rice bread and the cooked rice, and about the roasted beans and the cooked beans. He himself makes those chilukim. So that's clearly not the pshat. What he meant to say, that as long as anything you make out of it would automatically be awesome. Clearly, his intention was a concept which we find in many places of a loy bakiyim. We don't want to have to start judging in every type of how chashuv is this cut of meat. Is it? So therefore, we say as long as this type of tafshil, if it's prepared properly, then it's oila shulchan malachim. So then we're not mechalik. Okay.